Welcome, folks. Welcome, tag members. Welcome, others, members of the public and other guests. I'm Rick Weston, chair of the Vermont Clean Heat Standard Technical Advisory Group. A little bit of housekeeping to begin. Ask that everyone stay muted unless you are speaking. And as a general matter, we refrain from using chat. Certainly, we don't take comments from the public in chat. We set aside time at various points in the meeting for public comment. If you are also not, please keep, as I said, please keep muted unless you're speaking. And I ask that you also turn off your video unless you're a member of the tag or are speaking. That's helpful. We have alternates for Efficiency Vermont today. Adam Sherman, David Westman, and Haley, I believe, are doing this as well. Haley Rowe, as well as Ben Plotzker. Is that right, Emily? Do I have it, or did I get it? I may have gotten that wrong.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. It's
okay, perfect. We just have Ben Plotzker today listening in, but it should just be me for participation.
That's right. Okay, I knew I had that wrong. Thank you. Okay, to start, are there any changes or additions to the agenda that tag members would like to make? Okay, hearing none. Then let's go to the review and approval of the minutes of the last meeting. I hope you've all had a chance to review them. I was not there, so I will not participate in this vote, but are there any changes that are needed? And if not, take a motion to adopt them.
So moved.
That was Matt, thank you. All in favor, signify by raising your hand. The hand signal is the thing, or that way, yeah. Okay. I think that's that does it. I think that's approved. Great. Okay, well, with that, let's turn to the agenda. First with updates from the PUC. Deirdre Morris, you're on.
Sounds good. So two small reminders that were mentioned at the last meeting. We do have a request for comment in the rulemaking case that was kind of outside of the scope of this full group, but is on the obligated party credit fulfillment plans and criteria, not compliance and waiver process. And that comment period closes on Monday. So if any of you would like to comment in your individual capacity, feel free to do so. I mentioned that the interim decision on credit methodology would be out. And it was issued early last week. So that's out there. And then finally wanted to report on the clarification sought from the commission on how we were interpreting fuel. And most recently came up in the on opinion dynamics early measure characterizations. So I also acknowledge there were mixed messages given on this question, particularly during the fuel dealer registration period. But having spent more time with statute, our interpretation is that because the thermal sector is defined as having the same meaning as the RCI sector in inventory, that we need to regulate all sales of fossil fuel-based heating fuel, which includes fuel used for space heating, water heating, and cooking, as those are included in the RCI sector. So, we plan to raise the unintended consequences of how far-reaching this is in the second checkback report, but that in the meantime, this approach appears to be dictated by how statute is currently written. Wanted to provide that update as we've gotten it from the commissioners. I think that's all I have for updates this week, but welcome any questions. Ken, I see your hand.
Ken and then Matt. Thank you, Deirdre.
And I just didn't. I forgot to put it down. Sorry.
Matt?
Yeah, thank you, Deirdre. So a couple of questions. One is fuel dealers that did register, and about 60% did register, but 40% did not. But those that did register, would they have to redo their forms to indicate that the gallons that they sold for cooking were in fact redo the form? And the second part is heating fuel is also used not just for cooking, not just for heating air or heating water, but it's also used for power generation. And it's used for powering vehicles, propane, auto gas. It's also used for powering off-road equipment. What is the ruling by the PUC regarding those uses, whether it comes to RCI and the inventory?
Yeah, so the commissioners are aware that this is not a completely resolved question. I mean, we are sticking with the 5 regulated fuels in statute that, heating fuel is defined as fossil-based heating fuel, oil, propane, coal, kerosene, gas. But we're still trying to work through the lack of clarity in the legislation. And I'm not really in a position to comment on how to entirely fix the registration process at this time. But question is noted, aware of the issue. Thanks for raising it.
Thank you, Dee.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Deirdre. Anything else? Well, if not, let's get to the main event. We're going to hear from the department and their consultant, NV5 and E3, on the preliminary results of their potential study. TJ, I'm going to turn it over to you. Catherine's going to jump in. We've got obviously a lot to go over, so we want to manage this conversation. And so we want to give a little bit of thought to that as we start. So,
I guess the first question, TJ, is is NV5 prepared to present from their screen? They have that capability now. Okay.
Yep. So, yeah, Ben Cartwright from NV5 is here and will be the lead presenter anyway. So, are there other logistical things you wanted to address?
Well, just wanted to find out if NV5 would be amenable to having questions throughout the presentation. And that doesn't mean every slide, but if they could find the appropriate times to pause and take questions, since it's such a lengthy presentation, we can I think it would be hard to save all that till the end, but I don't want to stop them at every slide every time a hand goes up. So I'll leave it to their discretion as to when they want to stop and start taking questions and logical points.
We would prefer to wait just because the context of the entire presentation kind of paints the picture for the overall results. And we believe, a lot of questions may get answered towards the end of the presentation. So if possible, if we all could keep track of our questions until the end. I know it'll be long, but I think that'll serve timing a little better if we can.
So I'm not asking for frequent breaks, but are there no logical breaks, like after you've covered all the assumptions, that would make sense to just at least take some preliminary clarifying questions so that we, not getting into the debate? I think that would be helpful, just so we could make sure that everybody understands, at least as you move through this, and doesn't have outstanding questions that interfere with them being able to understand the whole rest of the presentation.
Yep. Yeah, that's fine. I think just making sure we keep track of time when we do that, but yeah.
Absolutely.
Sure. We thought a one spot might be after slide 13, after you finish the methodological ones. Okay.
Yeah, let's start there. I think that's a good idea.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay, TJ.
Okay, well, thank you. I will be pretty brief here, but I just want to introduce NV5, who has developed a potential study here. What you're going to see today are really draft results. We're at the department still internalizing these and coming up with questions also, I think. And so this is really an opportunity for TAG to get in and understand what the draft looks like after, a couple months ago, NV5 came in with its methodology for how we're going to do the potential study. And now this is really the initial take on what it looks like. And we sent around to the TAG members last night. And apologies, it wasn't further in advance, but I sent it around last night, this presentation and one backup workbook. And we'll get to process going forward, but we're really looking forward to the TAG's insights and comments here to help us review these draft results from NV5. With that, I'll turn it over to NV5. And the last thing I'll say is I do appreciate the timing that we're of NV5 kind of pushing to get some draft results here before the TAG on July 25th, well over a month before we are putting a final report into the PUC on September 1st due date. So a lot of work has gone into this and there's more to come. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ben.
Great. Thanks, TJ. And thanks again to the TAG for giving us time, a lot of time today to review our results. Can I get a quick confirmation that you can see my screen from someone? Okay, great.
Yes.
Okay, well, as Catherine mentioned, a lot to go through today. So, quick review of some of the topic areas. I'll do quick introductions of the team who's on the call today that supported this project. We'll do a quick overview of the project summary in terms of how it applies to clean heat standard legislation. We'll go through the methodology that we used to model potential study results. We'll define the scenarios. We'll all hear some terms that we'll help define throughout the presentation. We'll review the steps, stages in the process of the potential study model, as well as identify and discuss some of the assumptions we've made along the way. Then we'll get into our results. We'll review the results on the technical potential. And again, we'll define what these types of potential are as we go through and review the top measures by emissions reductions on the technical potential results. And then we'll dive into more of the bulk of the presentation, which is reviewing what we're calling the maximum achievable results. And then ultimately the draft Act 18 optimized results. So most of the material today will be focused on what those optimized results will be. Those slides will support the data from the results on Act 18 optimization by reviewing the emissions reductions and totals. We'll look at the potential study results in terms of the benefits and costs that they're producing, as well as what the hypothetical program costs might look like based on our potential study results. And then we'll dive into overall emissions from the clean heat standard measures by measure and by sector. We'll look at it for fuel switching measures as well as overall emissions by cost effectiveness. And then we'll look at what our top measures are by emissions reduction by sector. So we'll look at the residential sector top measures. We'll look at the commercial industrial sector top measures, as well as what we're calling sector neutral, which would be the fuel top fuel measures. And then we'll review a few assumptions on how we're defining the clean fuel carbon intensity limits, and then discuss how we've modeled low and moderate income potential, which is also a big part of the clean heat standard legislation. And then I'll review some next steps, a lot of which will be incorporating your all feedback today and through the comment period. So just quick, brief introductions. NV5 was the overall project manager for the potential study project. And as TJ mentioned, E3, Energy and Environmental Economics, supported the project as the emerging fuel subject matter experts. On the call today is myself, Ben Carreta, overall project manager for this project. and joined today by Matt Sachs, Cliff McDonald, and Griff Keating from NV5, who will be presenting and answering questions on the potential study results. And from E3, we have Dr. Bill Weedle, who was our emerging fuels technical lead, who supported the modeling and data on the emerging fuels end. A quick summary of the overall project objective relative to the Clean Heat Standard. So again, Clean Heat Standard written to support the goals of the Global Warming Solutions Act, which is intended to reduce emissions from the thermal sector in Vermont through clean heat credits, representing emission reductions from clean heat measures. The potential study, and we'll get into the details of this, really are to support those clean heat measures and what the potential of those look like. And we'll be reviewing the results of the clean heat measure mixes based on what's technically achievable, what maximum achievable scenarios, and economic screens of those as well, which all ultimately will help inform the price and amount of credits for these clean heat measures. And then, the final results, which most of the presentation will review today, will be focused on what we're calling Act 18 optimized results. And again, this is a scenario to optimize the measure mix that we'll be talking about to meet the requirements of Act 18. So with that, I'll turn it over to Matt Sachs to start talking through the methodology of our potential study.
Thanks, Ben. And thanks everyone for the opportunity to talk about this important topic today. So I'll start off with some methodology assumptions here, running through some general assumptions and then some scenario specific assumptions. This is certainly not the full gamut of assumptions that are baked into this study, but are intended to give some of the most important assumptions. Obviously there are thousands of individual inputs on measures and costs and savings and all those things, which we won't be diving into in this presentation. But these items here are intended to give it the broad contours of how this work was conducted. So the first thing I'll mention here, as TJ already kind of alluded to, these are draft results. We are continuing to review them both internally and with PSD staff support. And certainly we'll include any input we get from this meeting and any submitted comments after the fact. And just a general caveat on the second item here. When you're doing, I think, any potential study, there's a significant amount of simplification, or treating different market segments is more or less a kind of a monolithic block, when we know that there is significant variation within those in terms of consumption patterns, installed equipment, and those types of things. And in order to conduct a study of this scope, it requires some aggregation and simplification of those studies to reflect those segments. In addition, there are certainly, this is a projection of the future, and predicting the future is always uncertain. Specifically here, where we're dealing with some nascent technologies and measures, projections of future costs and availability are definitely uncertain. And as I would caveat any study with a 25-year analysis period, I would do the same here. That we're more confident about near-term values, but as the market evolves and we begin to see differences in trends for costs and adoption. If we were to conduct this study 3 or even a year or 2 from now, things might look, the long-term values might look considerably different. I would also mention one, I think, priority change that has yet to be implemented into these results. So I think it's important to keep in mind, and I'll probably reiterate this throughout the presentation. But our current version of the results are based on the 2020 Vermont greenhouse gas inventory. There has subsequently been the 2021 version published, and we also have preliminary values projecting out to 2023. Because of some changes in well, methodology and assumptions and ability to disaggregate some of the fuel consumption a little bit, the values for all years were impacted in the most recent version of the inventory. So not only do we have updated values for 2020 through 2023, the 1990 value, which is the baseline for the 2030 and 2050 GWSA targets, has also changed. The result of this is that in pure metric tons of CO2 emissions reductions, that target for 2030, for instance, is now 30% lower than we had originally modeled. I don't think that necessarily correlates to a 30% reduction in necessary program activity to get there, based on the fact that it's not just a uniform reduction across all sectors and fuel use, but it should result in a reduction in participation requirements and the costs associated with those scenarios designed to meet the targets. So we are actively working to incorporate that latest kind of late breaking data, but I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as we proceed. Next slide, please.
I know you didn't want clarifying questions, but can you I just wanted to make sure I'm understanding that correctly. Are you saying we only have to go from, can you just go back to the previous slide just for a sec?
Sure.
We only have to go from 2.3 to 2.26, so a 0.04 reduction. Am I understanding that? Like, I just want to make sure I'm interpreting that correctly.
Sure. Well, the 2.26 is the total emissions in 1990, or the revised total emissions in 1990 for the RCI sector. So the goal in 2030 would be a 40% reduction relative to that. So yeah, you need to reduce 40% of that. So whatever that math works out as, you need to go from 2.3 in 2023 down to, I guess, 60% of that value. The 2.26 value.
Okay, thank you. That just seemed like a really small reduction.
You're practically there. I wish.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So next, I just want to run through the scenarios we looked at in this work. At NV5, we conduct a bunch of potential studies. We actually wrote the manual on conducting these probably about getting close to 20 years ago now. And I think it's worth noting that the approach to this study kind of diverged with the standard approach and the standard definition of those typical potential study scenarios a bit. So I think it's worth discussing where those differences are and why they were done this way. So we looked at four scenarios, if you will. A technical potential, which we defined as looking at the technical potential of each measure without any competition. So essentially looking at what's the potential for a given measure if it was in a silo, like it was the only option, without respect to any interactions or competition with other measures. That's kind of a stepping stone to the next scenario, which was the maximum achievable scenario. Here we consider what we think the maximum adoption could be of each opportunity through what we call idealized program design. You have supporting program efforts to reduce market barriers to the extent possible, while also offering incentives that cover 100% of installed costs. I'll get into the question of costs a little bit later here, so I think that bears a little discussion. Then we moved on to the Act 18 optimization scenario. That is I would characterize it as both an adjustment and an optimization to the maximum achievable potential. And I'll get into the details of why I kind of characterize it that way in a bit. But the core of that is the core goal of that was to achieve the GWSA targets, both the 2030 and the 2050 targets, as well as adhere to some of the other guidance and requirements in Act 18 regarding prioritization of low and moderate income and cost efficiencies. And finally, we list economic potential last here, and this is one of the key areas of divergence from a standard study. Just briefly, the economic potential in a potential study is where you only look at particular opportunities that pass some primary cost effectiveness test. In this work, we're using the Vermont Societal Cost Test as the primary cost test. And whereas in a typical study, we typically proceed from technical potential and then apply that economic screening. That varies depending on the regulations of a specific jurisdiction. Sometimes that's applied at the measure level, sometimes at the sector level, sometimes at the program level, or some combination of those. Here, since there are no explicit cost effectiveness requirements of Act 18, this is really just applied as a reporting layer, if you will. Where we look at the portion of the maximum achievable potential and the portion of the Act 18 optimized potential that passes that cost effectiveness test. So it's just really for informational purposes to see, okay, here's what needs to be done, but here's how it shakes out relative to that societal cost effectiveness test. Next slide. Just a brief, high-level overview of how the modeling has proceeded for this work. And I got into a little bit of this in terms of the scenarios. But we start out characterizing individual clean heat standard eligible measures, looking at the costs, savings, lifetimes, load shapes for when across different energy or avoided cost periods they actually save energy, other impacts such as deferred replacement credits. So that's costs that a participant would avoid down the road if they replace their equipment early, things like that. And if you recall, we had the full list of clean heat standard eligible measures that we distributed, I guess probably a couple of weeks back at this point. And we're really working to flesh that out and develop all these individual parameters that allowed us to conduct the rest of the work. Next, we had to define the applicable market. We have all these characteristics at the measure level, but certainly they don't apply to every household or every square foot of commercial building space. So we had to take the next step of disaggregating the market, identifying which measures are applicable to which segments of the market, so that we can estimate the potential for those measures where applicable. Which takes us to the next step, estimating the technical potential. There we're saying, okay, well, if this is a measure that's applicable to this market, what is the total potential for that measure? Assuming you could do all of it instantaneously without any market barriers. And again, that's primarily a stepping stone to the next steps in the analysis, which is consideration of those things we're ignoring in that technical potential, namely mutual exclusivity or competition, if you will, and any interactive impacts. So if you for an example on interactive impacts, if you were to weatherize a home and then install a heat pump, the savings for the heat pump are going to be lower had you not weatherized, because you're reducing the heating and cooling loads through that first measure. So those interactive impacts are considered, so that we can, as well as the impacts of competition, so that we can end up with a estimate of potential that is additive and doesn't have any embedded double counting. The next step here is to apply adoption curves. We know that as opposed to our technical potential, we don't unfortunately have that magic wand where we can put in all eligible measures overnight. Here is where we consider the likely uptake of measures, given some assumptions about barriers for each individual measure, and the assumed financial incentives that some program or program entity would be offering for these things. And when we apply those adoption curves, as well as consider the impacts of mutual exclusivity and interactions, we end up with an estimate of maximum achievable potential. And again, that is what we consider possible, again, given idealized supporting program designs and incentives that cover 100% of measured costs. And from there, we move on to adjusting and optimizing that scenario to meet the Act 18 requirements to the extent possible and hit the GWSA targets. And then finally apply that cost effectiveness screening layer that I discussed in the last slide. So now just to run through a few, I think I hit on a lot, if not most of these things in the previous discussion, but we have a few assumptions here, beginning with some general assumptions and then some scenario specific ones. But these are worth noting. Generally speaking, the analysis assumes that the baseline for any measure is the existing conditions. So if you're considering, a heat pump, what is the existing HVAC system? It is the baseline for that measure. We're essentially considering all fuel switching measures as time discretionary retrofits, as opposed to time of failure market interventions, just because that's how these types of systems are typically installed. They aren't an emergency replacement type of activity when you're conducting a fuel switch with equipment. So that's, I think, a more realistic characterization of those types of measures. We also assume that we assume like for like replacement when the existing equipment would have failed. So if a particular household is heating their home with a furnace, we assume that, but for some program intervention, they would have otherwise installed a similar furnace in its place. We also all of our results here are representing gross savings or gross potential. In other words, we're not considering any net to gross ratios or any considerations for free ridership or spillover. This is consistent with the goal of hitting the GWSA requirements, which are measured in terms of the actual emissions reductions. There's no consideration for net versus gross impacts. It's purely based on the estimated actual emissions. We also assume that the baseline forecasted energy use is flat over the analysis period. This should specify that this is for existing buildings. We also consider new construction, which certainly add to load growth. But for existing buildings, we're assuming that conventional fuel consumption, again, if not for clean heat standard intervention, would remain flat over the analysis period. I also note just right up front here that one of the key distinctions, I think, in Act 18 in terms of how clean heat credits are measured or intended to be measured versus the accounting for those GWSA targets. The clean heat standard is envisioned as a tool to meet those GWSA targets, as such, we are presenting emissions impacts both consistent with the greenhouse gas inventory accounting, but we're also looking at annual life cycle emissions reductions. And the latter one is important because that's how the clean heat standard or clean heat credits are valued in life cycle emissions reduction. So there's a bit of a nuance around there, and I did take a peek at the agenda. Looks like this is on one of the topics for today. But there is a nuance there that's worth noting. Most of the results in this presentation, unless otherwise noted, are using the greenhouse gas inventory accounting approach so that we can report potential consistent with the GWSA targets. But we've also quantified in this work life cycle emissions reductions as well. And also just a quick note here, so I think this is a special case for wood heating. In terms of the life cycle emissions on wood, we are using the GWP bio factor of 0.3 to reflect Vermont's forest. And this is, I think, consistent with assumptions in the greenhouse gas inventory as well. We also make the assumption that renewable and biofuels need to be, in terms of their treatment as a clean heat measure, need to be repurchased every year. In other words, those have a measure life of 1, because there's not much in the way of preventing someone from backsliding. In other words, that's a measure that needs to be quote unquote reinstalled every year or readopted every year. And this is in contrast to our treatment of electrified customers, or I guess more generally, customers who have fuel switched. Because of the level of effort required in changing your heating fuel, we assume there's not going to be any backsliding with these customers. So once somebody chooses to go electric for a given end use, or I should say non-conventional fuels, switch away from conventional fuels, they will not revert to a fossil fuel fired piece of equipment. When it comes time to replace their equipment, they will stick with their new fuel type. Next slide, please.
Matt, I think we had a question on this slide.
Hold on before we go. We're not taking questions from the public, only members of the TAG at this point. We've got a raised hand from someone named Casey Coda. I don't know who that is. So I'm assuming that's not a TAG.
Yes, and I have gotten other questions from the public in chat about whether or not we're going to have a comment option for the public. I'd suggest that we do add that at the end of the NV5 session, so it doesn't get so far removed for the public to be able to ask questions or have comments if it's TAG members. But for right now, no TAG members. So if TAG members could keep your hands down and refrain from using the chat until we get there.
Yep.
Brian, though, Brian, is this a clarifying question? Let's just be clear. If we're gonna break for questions, it should be clarifying questions only.
No, it's a comment regarding the GWP biofactor. That was included as an example in last year's inventory, but just an example. So there's no, I understand why it's in here. In the updated inventory, we acknowledged that there are ways to account for biogenic emissions, but there is no official position on the biogenic emissions in the official inventory will show up in the land use and land use change sector, and not in the sectors that are counted in accordance with the GWSA targets. So appropriate to acknowledge that here, but it's not a that number's not in the official inventory.
Yeah. Thanks,
Right.
Brian, for that clarification. I just want to be sure for all comments, we do not, right now, let's focus on the potential study and not the greenhouse gas inventory. We could talk about the inventory with ANR at another time, but I just want to be clear, we want to be focused on the potential study. Thanks.
Thanks, TJ.
I just have a brief clarification, if that's okay.
Sure.
So when you did the analysis about biofuels versus installed measures, you call it fuel switching, but we know there exists now and there will exist in the future elements where installed measures such as a heat pump will supplement the existing heat, or the existing heat will be kept as a backup, whether it's wood or gas or oil. Did your analysis contemplate the fact that there will be two heating systems and it won't be, not all installations will be fuel switching?
Yes. Yes. In
Where is
our
that
measure.
noted?
I'm sorry.
Where is that noted? I mean, you have fuel switching and then you have clean fuels, but where is the hybrid option?
Yeah, I think it's characterized under fuel switching in terms of it's a partial fuel switch for a given household. It would be under fuel switching, except it would be a measure that doesn't address the full heating load of a building.
Okay, if folks could hold their questions until we get to a breaking point, we had suggested slide 13, but instead of stopping the conversation every slide, let's keep moving as far as we can get. So go ahead.
Yep. Moving on here. So technical potential. I think we've run through most of these, but I'll briefly mention again that the technical potential assumes that you can do all technologically feasible measures and that they can be installed essentially overnight. And we also make the assumption that measure impacts persist over the entire analysis period, regardless of their measure life, because it's important to see what the cumulative impacts are, all the way out to 2050, because we want to take into consideration, the impacts on emissions reductions, assuming that, customers or participants are going to replace their, in the case of fuel switching measures, take a like for like replacement with their new fuel switched equipment, if you will. The exception here is the, biofuels and renewable fuels, because we have that assumption that those are implemented annually, and because those being fuels as opposed to equipment or capital measures, the availability or a projected availability of those fuels increases over time. So it's important to look at those on a year-by-year basis, and then look at the cumulative impacts at the end of the analysis period. So a bit of a nuance on the treatment there. Because if we only looked at the potential using the availability in the first year of our analysis period, 2026, and then assume you do that same amount of biofuels and renewable fuels, would look much smaller than it otherwise might if you take that year-by-year approach, which considers annual availability. Again, the technical potential results are measure level technical potential, just assuming that measure was implemented to the full extent in a silo. Therefore, the measure level potential for the technical scenario is not additive. I think it's important to note. And again, as I mentioned, technical potential helps us get to the next scenarios in the process, but in and of itself is not a particularly useful scenario to look at. Next slide. Moving on to maximum achievable potential. Here again is where we introduce adoption curves that consider market barriers and reflect the adoption of measures over time, as opposed to just assuming they're all adopted instantaneously up to 100% of the available market. We take into consideration competition and interactions. I'll have a little bit more on interactions in the next slide. We also assume for the maximum achievable potential, we're just assuming incentive costs and not any administrative program costs. Important to note here again that the maximum achievable potential is assuming program incentives are available to cover 100% of total installed costs. This assumption probably needs a little discussion. So installed costs, as we're treating them here, are the total estimated equipment and labor costs that a customer or participant would pay for the installation of a clean heat measure. So, oftentimes in potential studies, you'll hear terms such as like measure costs or incremental costs thrown around. The way we're modeling measures here, the total installed costs really are the incremental costs in this case, because we're treating fuel switching measures with equipment as time discretionary. So those full upfront costs are what a participant would experience, even though there might be some, and there likely is some, a cost that they're avoiding down the road, and having to not replace their equipment, which would have failed, 5, 6 years in the future. So that deferred replacement credit that we call it is not taken into account when we're estimating incentive cost coverage, because we're trying to estimate what the high bar value of what it would take to influence these time discretionary retrofits. One exception here worth noting is that the quote unquote installed costs for biofuels and renewable fuel measures is calculated as the difference in retail costs between the baseline conventional fuel and the whatever clean fuel pathway we're talking about. That you can kind of consider that the measure cost for fuels, as it's just that increment in cost between the two. So if we see, if you see installed costs presented for clean fuels, that's what that represents. And one final note here, the electric things like electric panel upgrades and pre-weatherization barrier costs are not considered, are not estimated in the total installed costs. So things like needing to do some structural work on a home or fix a leaking roof before you can insulate an attic, those types of costs aren't captured here. And one other note on maximum achievable is that per requirements in Act 18, clean fuels, certain renewable and biofuels are disqualified by pathway if and when they exceed certain carbon intensity requirements spelled out in the Act. Next slide. This slide kind of demonstrates, how interactions work in the model. Using kind of an assumed loading order for a given measure. This is essentially how we account for, one measure reducing the available load for the next measure in that hierarchy, if you will. So just as an example here, we have, a general measure loading order of doing what we call energy efficiency measures first, things like weatherization and, aerators, that kind of thing. And then doing what we call fuel switching measures here. And what we mean by this is fuel switching with equipment involved. So heat pumps going to, or going to a wood heating system or something like that. And then finally, the application of clean fuels, which is the term we are referring to, biofuels and renewable fuels throughout the presentation. So just an example of how this would apply for a single family home for a space heating end use. We might assume that, air sealing is done first, then insulation, then advanced thermostats, then partial electrification, then clean fuels, and then finally partial to full electrification. And it's important to note this is how we deal with interactions to avoid double counting. It doesn't factor into the selection of which opportunity to do. And when it comes to conducting the measure level cost, societal cost benefit screening for these things, we don't reduce those the savings by interactions, because it's important to say, like, okay, well, if this measure was done in a vacuum, what are the economics of it and it alone? But when we look at the overall cost effectiveness of the portfolio, we do have to consider those things, because otherwise we end up with double counting of benefits. Another example here, which for an industrial process and a manufacturing facility, there are other cases where the only option is clean fuels. There just aren't modeled other modeled clean heat measures associated with it. Next slide. Moving on to the Act 18 optimized scenario. I think it's important to point out one caveat here from a traditional potential study approach. In conducting maximum achievable potential in I'd say a more traditional potential study, incentives typically are limited to 100% of incremental measure costs, or in this case, it's installed costs. Just as kind of standard practice. Because one of the overarching goals of the Act 18 optimized scenario is to reach the 2030 GWSA targets. That required relaxing this limitation, and in some cases exceeding 100% of the incremental measure cost or installed measure cost to really move the market quickly enough to hit those targets. So I think this is important to mention, because if you look at Act 18, you might the Act 18 optimized scenario, you might think it should be lower than max achievable in all cases, but that's not the case. Optimized kind of reflects using this lever of increased incentives to accelerate the potential in order to hit targets. So it's not explicitly a subset of the maximum achievable potential in this case. And as I've alluded to, in Act 18 optimized, we did increase incentives to 125% of installed costs, and correspondingly increased adoption rates for fuel switching measures in the low income sector specifically. This is in an attempt to prioritize low income homes, consistent with the language in the Act. We also assumed faster or quicker uptake for manufactured housing rebuilds. And similar to the max achievable potential, we also assumed that phase out in eligibility of clean fuels consistent with Act 18. One important thing to note here is that the draft Act 18 optimized potential results, they currently reach the 2050 GWSA targets early, and I'd say considerably exceed them in 2050. One of the revisions we're actively working on is to not overshoot that target. So through some ongoing work, we'll reduce the adoption and by way of reduced incentives for some of those most expensive measures in the later years, so that we're not exceeding 80%. So this will reduce the overall cost of the portfolio. Next slide. So I think just one more here, and then we'll pause for questions. The economic potential, as I've mentioned, we're using the Vermont Societal Cost Test as the primary test. And again, I'll note we're just using economic potential here as really a reporting layer to disaggregate the identified potential in the maximum achievable scenario in the Act 18 optimized scenario into what is economic versus uneconomic from a societal perspective. I'll also note that the draft results assume the 2022 EPA social cost of carbon value for the 2% discount rate scenario. I understand this is still pending with the Vermont Climate Council, hasn't been formally adopted, but it's one of the inputs that we're closely tracking and we'll update if need be once that final decision is made. And one final note here, for the purposes of monetizing the impacts of avoided emissions, we're using the life cycle emissions factors. All right, and with that.
Okay, let's take a few questions from the tag if we have them. I will remind folks that we've got roughly an hour left on the agenda for this, so we do want to cover a lot of material, and I encourage all of us to be economic in that regard. We'll go longer if we need to, but for now we got about an hour left. Emily.
I think I have answered my own question, but I just wanted to double check. Can you go back to the maximum achievable potential slide? The way that this was reading to me around the assumptions for incentive costs made it seem like there is some kind of like total budget applied as a limiting factor, but that's not the case, right? This is as much as can be installed based on adoption curves, considering market barriers and competition and all that, but like as much as possible, budget is not a constraint. But then as you're calculating what it would cost, you're only factoring in the incentive costs and not the administrative costs and the panel upgrades. Did I state that correctly? I just wanted to double check.
Yeah, I mean, assuming that you're only offering incentives that cover 100% of installed cost is like kind of a de facto budget limitation. And I think it's a practical constraint we use for the scenario. One, because it's usually dictated in the scopes of scoping out potential studies. But I think there has to be some limit applied. Otherwise, you could assume you pay 10 times the cost of equipment, and the sky's the limit on how much you can do and how quickly. So I think that is a budget limitation, and because of our relaxing of that for the Act 18 optimize, that we are able to primarily accelerate the adoption of potential, but there is a little overall increase. It's very small, but in the long-term identified potential as well.
Sam?
Thanks. I have just two hopefully quick questions. First, and if you wouldn't mind staying on this slide here, when we're looking at, I guess in this case, the disqualification of clean fuels based on declining CI target, but I think this applies broadly to all resources. Are you assuming a decline in CI for the different resources? So for example, as the grid gets cleaner, right, like probably half of the CI score for a clean fuel today is made up of electricity consumption for production. We would expect those to decrease substantially over time, right? Improvements in technology, but especially the CI for electricity. So I'm wondering, are those static in your analysis for just what they are today being carried out through 2050?
Yeah, I would suggest tossing this over to Bill. I believe those are static. I can't confirm they're static for all biofuels and renewable fuels pathways. Bill, can you weigh in on this one?
I believe that they're all static, but that is a good point that some renewable fuels CIs would improve substantially as electricity becomes cleaner. The caveat to that is that we haven't really identified specifically where certain renewable fuels are coming from per se, right? Like that's a fuel by fuel. That's dependent on the fuel. And so that might be coming from a jurisdiction where electricity isn't getting clean as quickly as some other jurisdictions. And that's a level of granularity that we did not model. So, this would require us to be a little bit more judicious about like determining exactly how much fuel comes from where, and based on that, determine how the CI score would decline.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Thanks for the response. I think it is something that's going to be difficult to model, and there's certainly other CI reductions outside of the electricity input that we would expect to see too. I don't need to go too far into that right now, but I guess just a point of consideration for you. The other question that I had here was on, so we're saying that the installed cost for renewable fuels is calculated as the difference in retail cost between the renewable fuel and the fossil fuel. In the electricity sector, are you modeling any cost differences that could contribute positively or negatively to that picture? Like I assume that if a customer switches to a heat pump, they're going to, they're going to spend more on their electricity bill. Maybe that's less than they'd be spending on their fuel bill on net, but I'm curious. And again, I know this is maybe it goes too far in detail for what the modeling can even cover, but it's worth pointing out, I think, and asking you guys.
Yeah, well, that is quantified. In terms of the societal costs and benefits for fuel switching, that is one of the factors in that calculation. There is no, if I'm understanding your question right, like explicit feedback loop in terms of, likely participant, bill savings on their likelihood to adopt a given measure. We take that into consideration when we set the barriers and the adoption curves, but that doesn't change over time depending on like evolving energy prices or energy price forecasts, if you will.
Thank you.
And yeah, and one other note on, and sorry if I'm dwelling on this one, but one other note on the phase out of fuels. It's probably skipping ahead a bit, but the fuels phase out, and I know your comments probably has more implications than just whether a specific pathway is eligible or ineligible, but very very few pathways get eliminated in that phase out. I think we lose a couple, and I've got a slide in later in the deck in 2030, and then a few more in 2050. But a lot of the model pathways just aren't impacted by that phase out.
Thanks. Ken.
Yeah, my question is related to the adoption curves. And can you just maybe talk a little bit more about them with a specific emphasis on the relationship of the incentive amount and those adoption curves? Have you done kind of sensitivity analysis to determine how those adoption curves change if you go from 100% to a lower amount? I know you did to a higher amount to cover the low income stuff, but that's the general question. And I know that may be hard to answer here. So is there any way that we can get information about those adoption curves? Because this is going to be a critical issue for us in terms of developing incentive amounts. So yeah, that's my question.
Cliff, can you speak to this one?
Yeah, can people hear me?
Yes.
So So yeah, I mean, I guess this comes in is informed by kind of, you know, a lot of adoption curves that we already have and used in the potential study, but in potential studies in the past, but also based on kind of some of the research that was done in the past efficiency potential study that gave typical max adoptions based on incentive coverage. And so, yes, certainly, you know, there's some uncertainty and some, you know, inevitable uncertainty about, you know, the adoption curves. It's, you know, in my opinion, one of the places of highest uncertainty in potential studies. You know, I think we are assuming 100, and we haven't really talked about results yet, but you know, given the reductions that are needed to meet GWSA, you know, I think there needs to be some, you know, based on kind of traditional adoption curves, there needs to be some pretty generous incentives, you know, kind of based on those findings from of max adoption that we've used, as well as kind of the typical S-curve ramp rate. And we can get into more detail about how these were developed. But you know, yes, lowering adoption could this could be a programmatic strategy. To, you know, you could see a lot of different program strategies on modeling incentives, you know, potentially hitting the market with lower incentives and then raising them as you need to reach the harder to reach ones. But you know, that's very complex to model and has a lot of uncertainty. I'm sorry, I'm not totally sure I'm answering your question, but
I'm wondering, Ken, if you could, I'm sure you have some follow-up. Could we have a lot of hands up. Could we get to the rest of the questions and circle back to you, Ken, on this if there's more information?
Yeah, it's not really much in the form of a question, just kind of a request. If you could provide us some sample adoption curves, that's going to be really helpful.
Yeah.
So we got
I'll just note that the adoption curves, you know, we set a max adoption. We assume kind of an S-curve shape, a standard S-curve shape, where it's you have the early adopters kind of slowly ramping up, and then you have a steep curve of adoption where you know it's hitting the mass market, and then it tapers off again for the late adopters. And we're shifting those S-curves to attempt to reflect where in the market each technology is. So you know, in Vermont, there's already 20,000 or so heat pumps in place based on the heat pump database. So, you know, that it's not starting from zero, that S-curve, it's starting already maybe at the beginning, more towards the beginning of that steep ramp phase. But we can provide the backup and additional details on that.
That would be great. Thanks.
I'll just ask people to consider that, you know, the results are still to come in this presentation, and that may change the nature of your question and overlap. So just keep that in mind when you ask questions here. I'm afraid we're running out of time.
Short questions and short answers at this point until we get to the end, and then we can have a more fulsome discussion. So Brian and Luce.
I'm going to yield my question to have my place in the queue to Luce.
Okay.
Hi, I have just a couple quick comments as we go through this for TAG to consider. These are only program incentive costs, and I am concerned there's no administrative costs. So don't forget that. This is going to be a high administrative cost program. So somewhere we have to account for that. I'm also wondering if any, and this is as we go through it, has any incentives been thought about for schools, municipal buildings that, you know, could help a lot? Remember, school tax affects low-income people very much also. So just want to think about that. And I believe we should have some percentages in here for electrical panel upgrades, because we have a lot of old farmhouses in Vermont and they're not going to be able to do some of this. Thank you.
Okay, we have Matt next, and then Floyd.
Yeah, one quick request and one question. Thank you for the presentation, and I look forward to learning more. When you talk about fuel switching, you said it's not just about fuel switching, even though it says FS, it says fuel switching. It is, in fact, what we know to be true. Anyone that works in this field, that we have many homes that have dual fuel sources, heat pumps and wood, heat pumps and gas, heat pumps and oil. I think it would be helpful if you create a category that said that, So when it says fuel switching, we understand it is not. In fact, there are some whole home retrofits, but not in the majority of cases where our contractors are installing heat pumps. It's not a fuel switch station. It's reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but not replacing the boiler in the basement. And then the other point I would make is that I understand the calculus with renewable fuels. 1 year, got it, makes sense. What is the lifespan of the equipment? Is that clarified? If you install a heat pump, what is the assumption of how long that equipment will last?
Yeah, so just quickly on that, I want to reiterate that, you know, we do have partial installations. We have the explicit measures of partial heat pump installations or hybrid systems, and then we all have a later measure of a part to full replacement to allow some of those people who do partials to later go back and finish the rest of the job. So, you know, we do have that. I think, and I'm not sure if it's in the results in this presentation, but we have it as part of the results split up by measures. So, you know, that is something that we did model explicitly, you know, that assumption. That said, with the GWSA targets being so aggressive in 2030, I think just from a programmatic strategy, if to hit that 40%, you need to really encourage, you know, you need a model that really encourages full over partial. That's kind of, maybe we'll get into that later, but that's one of the findings. And then the analysis made an assumption that, you know, once you do the work and pay the money to switch and do a full replacement, a full fuel switch, heating electrification, you're not gonna revert back. So there's no baseline situations where people are fully converting and then 20 years later, 18, 20 years later, switching back to hybrid or fossil fuel.
Yeah, I one last comment. I would challenge that assumption. You know, the companies in Vermont that provide heating services and heating fuel, home switch. At the life of the equipment dies, they consider all their options, and we're seeing that in the marketplace. If you look at how the changes in primary source of fuel.
Okay, Floyd, and then I think we're ready for you to move through the rest of the presentation.
Okay, so I'll make it quick. So 3 questions. One is the loading order slide kind of jogged a thought in my head, which is there any consideration for the time, you know, incorporating time value of carbon into this analysis? In other words, you know, like reducing a ton of carbon today is, you know, has the same impact as, I think there's some analysis that shows it has the same impact as reducing 25 tons of carbon in 2030. So, which means that, you know, consideration of measures that can be done immediately can get you the biggest bang for your buck and get those reductions that are more impactful now than they would be 5 or 10 or 15 years from now. So that's question 1. Question 2, building on Sam's question, which I thought was great, on the static assumption of CI, specifically with biofuels, I would caution against making that assumption that CI is static. The science on life cycle assessments, especially with regard to purpose-grown biofuels, is continually evolving. And to give you an example, for soy biodiesel, the initial estimate in like 2009 was a 300 CI for indirect land use change. That's just the indirect land use change. That went down to 60 to 29. And then the latest estimate by Purdue is 9.7 as of last year. So that's a well over 90% reduction in that estimate. So that science is continually evolving. I would caution against assuming that CI is static. And then the third question, kind of a broader, and this may have been addressed earlier, and I apologize if I missed it. Will the model that's being used here be available for stakeholders to take a look at? I personally like to run my own scenarios to see if there are other ways to look at things. So that's a question for the NV5 folks. will this be posted on the website for stakeholders to download and run their own scenarios and so forth? Thank you.
I'll try to address these briefly. If you could share that information, I think beyond using a forecast of avoided emissions costs over time, there isn't, which factors into the societal cost effectiveness. I don't think there is consideration for the time value of avoided emissions. So if you could share that research via comments, we can consider it. And the note about CI, I know we talked about that a little bit. I think it's also worth mentioning we don't assume any technological advancement for any other measures as well. Arguably, other fuel switching opportunities would continue to advance over this same time period. So it is somewhat consistent with the overall approach. That we are assuming a static a CI there. But again, if you want to submit comments, with that documentation you mentioned about the constantly evolving CI of some of these renewable and biofuels, that would certainly be welcomed. And I think it bears repeating again that we're doing a long-term forecast here, and this study is intended to be redone every 3 years. So those kinds of input assumptions can certainly be updated in future iterations of this work. And then finally, on your model, we had not planned on sharing the underlying model publicly. We are planning to share updated inputs and assumptions, documentation, as well as iterations of the results as they're available. I think one set of the output reporting workbooks have been posted publicly to date.
All right, thank you for taking the time to answer that. And why don't you keep going and we'll find another point to take a break that you think is appropriate, but otherwise hold your questions and jot them down.
All right, thanks. So just moving on to the results, we have just one slide here on technical potential in the interest of time. As I mentioned, this in and of itself is not a particularly useful result, but allows us the information we need to proceed with the rest of the scenario work. So here we're presenting the top 10 measures ranked by the share of reductions required, RCI emissions reductions required in 2050. So just moving through this table here, first column is the measure, the second is the sector, third is the measure type, just FS is fuel switching with equipment, CF is clean fuels. We also have EE, but none of them show up on this list, which is more of energy efficiency measures as we're calling them. But the fourth column here, these percentages are the percent, basically treating the 2050 target as 100%. So you can interpret this as saying that ground source heat pump full replacement, if you did all of the technical potential in the residential sector, you could achieve 42.6% of that, of 100% of the goal in 2050. It's just a useful way to normalize, the relative scale of these things. And again, I'm not going to dwell on this slide too much. A lot of the impacts here are more informed by how the applicable market was disaggregated. So that, some of these top contenders, ground source heat pumps, they just apply to a large portion of the space heating market, similar to fossil fuel to wood heating, apply to large swaths of the market. But you can kind of get a sense of, where the highest technical potential, where the big hitters are, without consideration of competition and barriers and likely adoption. The final column here, and just to orient you on these tables because we've got these repeated throughout for the different scenarios. These are the present value net societal benefits in millions of dollars in 2024 dollars. So what this means is the difference of the difference in the present value societal benefits less the societal costs is $818 million for this ground source heat pump measure. You know, and again, you'll see that some of these are negative, you know, meaning that they fail the cost effectiveness screening test from that societal perspective. But I think, you know, in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the more informative scenarios here. So this slide, you know, presents a lot. So I'll try to break it down. But this is an overview of the maximum achievable potential. This column chart here reflects the RCI emissions, both historical and projected, assuming the reductions we're modeling over time. So the 1990 and the 2020 values are taken directly from the greenhouse gas inventory. And then we see those begin to decline over time, starting the first year of our analysis, 2026 through the end, 2020 or 2050. Those are in on this axis on the left here, denoted in thousands of metric tons of CO2. And then we're also presenting here what we're calling the net RCI emissions reductions relative to the 1990 baseline. We have two line graphs here. The solid line graph is including both the economic and the uneconomic potential, and the dashed line is just looking at the economic potential. Again, that's based on the Vermont societal cost test. So the line graphs are on this this right axis here, emissions reductions relative to the 1990 RCI baseline. And we can see here that the max achievable scenario doesn't quite reach the 2030 reduction target. We hit 37% in 2030 and exceed the target in 2031, getting up to 43% reduction. But the model does exceed the 80% target early in 2041. One other thing to note on this graph, and I guess throughout this whole analysis, is that, you know, when you're fuel switching, you know, electrifying thermal end uses, you know, that is going to result in some increased emissions outside of the RCI sector in the greenhouse gas inventory. So namely, increasing some emissions in the electricity consumption sector. So that's what's represented here by the golden portions of these columns. So what we're trying to see is, you know, we want to know what the net reductions are when you're also considering the increased, you know, electricity consumption emissions, because it wouldn't be fair to say that those are completely neglected because they're outside of the RCI emission sector. But you'll note that those emissions impacts are extremely small in the grand scheme of things. That's due in part because you know, the fuel switching measures to heat pumps are a bit slower to ramp, and we're also we have very sharply declining electric grid emissions factors over the same period. So those two factors, you know, I think result in those well, in addition to the emissions factors from the grid being relatively small to begin with, result in those being very, very small portions of these overall columns. one other thing to note here, again, just reiterating, is that the forthcoming updates to the RCI emissions inventory, both the baseline and then using the more recent emissions numbers, are going to reduce the required reduction, and will certainly impact the achievement over time in the scenario. Next slide, please. A quick summary on the costs associated with the scenario. Just looking at the modeled present value of the program incentive costs. Under the maximum achievable scenario, these are $17 billion as modeled. Again, just some insights around those incentive costs. Again, those assume some program covering 100% of total installed costs for these measures, or the incremental retail costs for fuels measures. They don't consider electric panel upgrades and pre-weatherization barriers as modeled, and any non-incentive program costs are not included. I think it's important to note that from a societal perspective, incentives are a kind of a transfer cost, essentially collected and returned to Vermont ratepayers. So when thinking about the total price tag, it's also important to consider the net societal benefits overall, societal costs and societal benefits, which take into consideration not only the net benefits from energy savings, other things like additional resource savings, emissions reductions, and other non-energy benefits, but also consider the impact of those deferred equipment replacement costs. When a participant would have otherwise had to purchase and install new equipment when their equipment would have failed, had not they opted to replace their heating and systems early. So the overall portfolio in the maximum achievable scenario has a present value net societal benefits of 3.6 billion. So another way to say that is the overall package is cost effective from that societal cost test, in that it has positive net benefits. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. One more nuance on that, and I think it's worth noting here. Those benefits don't include anything. While we make the assumption that there's no backsliding, if you will, for people that choose to electrify or fuel switch with equipment more generally, any benefits associated with that are after the end of the initial measure life aren't considered in this total. So we're not considering benefits are societal benefits for those types of measures in excess of the measure life. I think it's important to note. All right, next slide. All right, now jumping right into the Act 18 optimized potential. I'm going to talk about these two scenarios pretty closely together, but I just wanted to note that we'll be focusing most of our discussion on this Act 18 optimized potential. We've got similar breakdowns of the maximum achievable potential in a set of appendix slides to the slide deck that I think is available. If there's more interest in that stuff, but I think focusing on Act 18 is optimized as the most important focus for today. So the Act 18 optimized potential is, if you look at the shape and the overall scale, it's very similar to the maximum achievable potential. And as I've alluded to, getting to the targets, and actually we're still slightly under in this iteration of that 2030 target, so the 40% reduction. That is, that was necessary to kind of accelerate the adoption of some measures, primarily achieved through higher incentives for low income households. But by and large, there was, I guess I would characterize it as very, very little wiggle room to optimize the potential within max achievable. And I think one takeaway there is that the 2030 targets are how to characterize them best. They're aggressive. It's going to take a lot to get there over the next, essentially five years in this analysis period. So there's the need to accelerate that potential beyond what was characterized in max achievable. But the ability to cost optimize is somewhat limited. It's going to take at least an outcome of this analysis is it's going to take pursuing all available resources to meet these targets. So while we don't quite hit it in this iteration, we presume we will hit it in the final numbers, getting to 40% in 2030. Right now we exceed it handily by 5% in 2031. As with the max achievable potential, we're exceeding the 2050 target early, getting to 80% in 2040 here. One other thing to note is, again, we'll adjust this for the scenario for the final such that we don't overshoot. And this is where some of that cost optimization will come into play for the long-term potential, because here, since we're above the GWSA requirements, we do have some latitude here to reduce adoption for some measures to cost optimize the portfolio a little bit, just to hit the 80% targets. And as with the max achievable potential, the upcoming integration of the new emissions inventory numbers will likely result in our current modeling to exceed the targets, and then offer more ability to cost optimize within max achievable and still hit the GWSA targets. Next slide, please. Costs for the, because these scenarios ended up being somewhat similar, the overall modeled program incentives with our embedded assumptions are pretty similar to the max achievable totals. I think that was 17 billion. We're at 17.3 billion. So, assuming a slight increase in incentive availability for low-income households doesn't change the number drastically in terms of the total incentive budget or modeled incentive budget. As with the max achievable scenario, there's the same caveats here about what's included or not included, so I won't repeat those. And again, on the net societal benefits, these are round to the first decimal place in terms of billions to the same net societal benefits as the max achievable scenario. So long term, there's not a huge difference between these scenarios. It's more serving to accelerate the potential in an effort to hit the GWSA targets. Next slide, please. Maybe I'll pause there. The next series of slides gets into a little bit of the breakdown of the potential by resource, but this might be a good place to pause for questions.
Or pause for a break as well. We have a scheduled break, which we want to keep very short. But yeah, Brian, start.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Matt. Can you go back to slide 14? And I just want to know if you have this table for the maximum technical potential in Act 18 optimized potential, and also for those in 2030.
Yes, yes, we do.
Okay.
We do.
Great. Floyd?
Yeah, on this slide 14, can you elaborate on the negative societal benefits for renewable diesel, purpose-grown crops, and waste fats and oils? I mean, how did you arrive at that versus the other entry for advanced renewable diesel residues and waste, which is a positive societal benefit?
Yeah, I think the main differentiator here is on the relative costs and the emissions factors between these pathways. I don't want to speak out of turn here. I think I could respond to this better via writing with the specifics in front of me. But I think those are the key drivers that are feeding into this.
Okay, yeah, I'd like to get a little more detail on that because the retail price difference between these biomass-based diesels and fossil diesel is either cost competitive or at most parity, according to the data from Clean City, the Department of Energy's Clean Cities alternative fuel price report. So I'd like to see where that came from and how you arrived at that. A little bit more detail on that. And we're happy to share that price info. We also have price info, New York-based price info on biodiesel and renewable diesel. We're happy to share that with you.
Please do share it, Floyd, and you can share it via the email address that is at the end of this presentation. And TJ also put it in the chat.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
All the questions we have for now, and we do have a lot more content to cover. I'm wondering if folks would like to get through this first and then take a break, and then come back to the remaining questions. Or you want to take a break now for 3 to 5 minutes? Is there a preference?
Well, I'd say let's take it now, really. It's in the middle, but 3 minutes, no more.
All right, that puts you back here at 11:12.
Yep.
Start again. Thanks, folks. Okay, if folks could come back on camera to let us know you're here. And NV5 can get started again.
Yeah, and I would just add, Matt, Socks, by my count, you've got 10 more slides, actually 11 more slides, and we've got, we've got at least a half an hour. I mean, we'll go longer, but I encourage you to be efficient so that we can get through it and get whatever immediate questions we can back to you. Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, and I think we can move through these actually somewhat quickly, but I'll go fast. So thanks, everybody. The moving on to the kind of a breakdown of where this potential is coming from, at least at a high level in terms of the three measure types and sectors and that kind of thing. We have a series of figures here that kind of goes through that breakdown a little bit, just to give a little bit more insight into what's happening. So this first slide shows incremental annual incentive spending over time by measure type. And just I'll comment first on the overall shape of the curve here. What we're seeing here is that for many measures, we're starting out kind of in the high slope period of that S curve, if you will. So we're seeing high incremental annual participation, which leads to high incentive spending in the initial years of the period. And yeah, it's partially a result of where we are on adoption curves initially as the kind of the starting point. But it also is a reflection of just the need to hit these aggressive targets in 2030. So after this initial period, the incremental annual participation begins to drop off as your participation rates slow, and then gradually drop down over time. Just a few comments on the distribution. We've got energy efficiency called out here by this orange shaded section of the chart. The dark blue represents fuel switching, and that's again distinct from clean fuels as we're calling them here. So fuel switching with equipment versus clean fuels, which captures the biofuels and renewable fuels potential. Has been commented a few times, fuel switching here is also inclusive of any partial electrification from heat pumps, and then any subsequent partial to full transitions later in the analysis period. So we see here that the incremental incentives for efficiencies kind of start out high as there's a push for weatherization. That kind of goes down over time. Fuel switching kind of starts high and remains somewhat high over the period, but is largest in the initial years as you are on that high slope part of the adoption curves. And then a similar trend on clean fuels, as I'll get into. It's a little bit more clear in terms of greenhouse gas reductions charts, but those can contribute as we've modeled them a lot fairly quickly in terms of being their ability to ramp up, and then those two drop over time, kind of reflecting reduced incremental annual adoption over time. Next slide. So the next series of slides are presented in terms of cumulative annual GWSA emissions. So the axis, the y-axis, is consistent throughout the next few slides here. So again, this is breaking down the emissions reduction by those three broad measure types. We see here a pretty quick ramp up is necessary to hit targets. This kind of follows the shape we saw earlier. Biofuels, as I mentioned, has the ability to ramp up more quickly than some of those equipment measures. It's a little bit harder to discern on this graph, but it is true, even though we are also assuming pretty high ramp rates on other equipment measures. You know, the energy efficiency is not contributing a huge amount to the reduction potential. You know, one of the things we are revisiting is assumptions around the applicable market for weatherization measures. You know, we have kind of a bit of a conservative estimate on the applicable market for those measures. So just a note that the revised results may consider you know, broadening that that market a bit, which may you know, result in some more energy efficiency showing up in these charts. But the bulk of the reductions potential is through fuel switching measures. And I'll just note here there is a drop in the clean fuels potential in 2050, and that's just a result of the phase out in the Act 18 in that year, but it doesn't have an enormous impact overall. Next slide, please. This shows a similar figure, breaking things out by sector. As we've modeled things in the study, the clean fuels measures have all ended up in what we've called, dubbed here, kind of a sector neutral category. You know, the way we're modeling fuels is kind of from a top-down perspective, not on a, you know, participant per participant basis. You know, basically looking at the remaining fuel use in a given year, and then determining through adoption curves how much of that you think you could displace with clean fuels. So it's not modeled directly in a given sector, but as we'll get into a little bit later, we have distributed that among sectors in kind of a post hoc analysis to show some of the impacts specifically for low and moderate income subsectors. So I think, you know, the general shape is the same here, so I won't, you know, comment on that too much. And I think probably the long-term emissions reductions are probably, you know, kind of aligned with general expectations, with the bulk of it coming in from the residential sector, followed by commercial, and then the smallest coming from industrial. I will note that, you know, industrial is small here in that it only encompasses, you know, those efficiency and equipment fuel switching measures. But in likelihood, a lot of this, what we call the sector neutral potential in later years, really would be going to serve those hard to electrify end uses in the industrial sector. Next slide. This figure just isolates the fuel switching measure type, just to kind of give a breakdown of you know, what's really driving this is heat pump installations across sectors. Again, I don't think there's a huge story with this in terms of differences from the previous slides we've been looking at. You know, we see res kind of providing the bulk of the reductions through fuel switching measures, followed by commercial, and then industrial for the reasons we've already talked about. You know, and as we've already discussed, and there's a slightly lower growth trajectory associated with these fuel switching measures than the biofuels and renewable fuels is modeled. Next slide. This slide kind of presents the results of that economic screening I've mentioned a few times. So here we're showing again by measure type the emissions reductions potential, and also breaking that up into economic and uneconomic potential. So that is potential that passes the Vermont societal cost test, and the potential that does not. So you'll see here, using this same color scheme, we've got this orange shaded section for efficiency, and then the solid portion of that shape is for the economic, and then kind of the dashed sections of the shape are for uneconomic. And that's similar for the blue section for fuel switching, and then the yellow or gold section for clean fuels. And I think, one of the takeaways here is that the majority of the potential here is passing the societal cost test with our current assumptions. And I think it's also worth pointing out that in the early years, a lot of this clean fuels potential is uneconomic. And I think we can drill down into that based on some of the comments received earlier. But overall and long term, a significant portion of this potential is cost effective. But a takeaway here is that in order to hit targets, what this modeling is showing is that all opportunities need to be pursued, whether or not the individual opportunities pass the Vermont SCT. But again, as we've shown, the overall portfolio, inclusive of all measures, does pass that screening test. And then just finally, in the last year of analysis, 78% of the identified emissions reduction potential is cost effective. All right, you can move ahead. The next 3 slides, show those similar tables that I had shown previously, but these are a bit more informative in that, they are additive. So here we're showing the top 10 residential measures, by their contributions to the 2050 RCI emissions reductions target. So one thing I'd note, and I think it was Brian's comment earlier, is like just presenting the 2050 value does kind of obscure things a little bit, especially for the renewable fuels and biofuels measures, as we'll see, because of some of those dropping out as eligible measures. The contributions in 2050 for those are 0, whereas in previous years they are quite meaningful, as we saw from those previous figures. But here, just to kind of step through these fairly quickly, and I encourage others to run through these on their own. Ductless heat pumps, heat pump water heaters, central heat pumps. A lot of these fuel switching measures are the biggest hitters in the residential sector. As we step down, we do see a handful of at least one energy efficiency measure showing up in the top 10. That's advanced thermostats. But different flavors of heat pumps, whether they're full replacements, partial to fulls, or partial displacements, are populating most of the top 10 measure list in the residential sector. And I think that applies to C&I too, as we'll see. One note on the partial to fulls in the modeling. We basically assume that if a customer chooses to pursue a partial displacement, at some time down the road, they are eligible for they're part of the available market for those partial to full adoption. So that measure picks up later on in the analysis period, but isn't particularly large. It's like, for instance, if we looked at the 2030 number, that wouldn't be a huge contributor. Next slide, please. Similar table here for the C&I measures. I think similar to residential, since the bulk of the consumption is in space heating, we see a lot of these fuel switching with equipment space heating measures kind of bubble up to the top in the way of VRF heat pumps, network geothermal systems, and also ductless heat pumps for assumed to apply to smaller buildings. We see a couple of industrial measures that are likely to be pursued as custom measures, given that they're relatively nascent and require kind of bespoke solutions given the individual industrial process that we're addressing. But a few of those do show up in the top 10, or a couple rather. But otherwise, the bulk of this is made up through fuel switching with equipment, and then a small handful of efficiency measures via envelope improvements and advanced thermostats. Next slide, please. And again, one thing I should have clarified: this percentage is total. It's not against the sector total. So this last table here is showing contribution from sector neutral. So those are the clean fuels measure type, as we've talked about it. So this, for instance, the 10.3% is 10.3% of the total RCI emissions reduction target in 2050. Not that it really applies in this case, since it's sector neutral, but not to the individual sector that the table is presenting. So out to 2050, this one, as I mentioned, gets obscured a little bit because of some of the phase out of these fuels over time. But still, we see, particularly for advanced renewable diesel sourced from residues and wastes, significant contributor all the way out to 2050, responsible for over 10% of the modeled reductions in 2050. That, biomethane follows that, and then onward to hydrogen, and then different pathways of biomethane, and finally advanced renewable diesel, which has a small but non-zero impact in 2050. Next slide, please. I think I've only got a couple more slides, so I think I'll wrap up and then we can take some questions. The two things that I wanted to talk about with regard to the Act 18 optimized potential and the optimization is that, as I mentioned, that we did impose the Act 18 phase out on liquid and gaseous fuels over time. So just a little background on that. It's defined relative to number 2 fuel oil. That's given a carbon intensity of 100, and then the phase out requires that liquid and gaseous fuels can't exceed 80 in 2025, 60 in 2030, and or 20 in 2050. But the impacts of that, as I've mentioned, are actually pretty small, both in terms of the number of pathways impacted and in the overall potential. So the upshot is that in 2030, we lose both in-state and out-of-state resources for biomethane from landfill gas. And in 2050, we lose in-state and out-of-state resources for biomethane from wastewater feedstocks. And then finally, also in 2050, out-of-state resources for biodiesel and renewable diesel from purpose-grown crops become ineligible. And that's I think the most impactful change, I think, is driving most of that dip that we saw in 2050 and the emissions reductions. I think is coming from the elimination of that pathway. Next slide, please. The last item here is just some specific insight into the emissions reductions coming from the low income and the moderate income sector. So the Act has a requirement that of the annual clean heat credit that's required to be retired by obligated parties is at least 16%. 16% comes from customers with low income, and an additional 16% from customers with low income or moderate income. So we're presenting here the cumulative annual life cycle emissions reductions. So this is the one place I would contrast that the rest of these have been in terms of GWSA accounting from the greenhouse gas inventory. Here we're talking about life cycle emissions because this is kind of couched in the context of clean heat credits, which implies life cycle emissions accounting. So just pointing out that change from the previous slides. This dashed line here is the 16% target each year. The dark blue line shows where we're at with the Act 18 optimized potential for low income. We see that we're falling short of that 16% requirement, kind of starting out around 14%, but that does go down over time. Moderate income exceeds that 16% in all years, starting out just a hair under 21%, and then falling to about 17% over the analysis period. One caveat in the analysis approach here, as I think I mentioned earlier, in order to break out, because we took a sector kind of agnostic approach to the clean fuels potential characterization, because we don't want to underestimate contributions going to these specific subsectors. We have apportioned that clean fuels potential to these segments based on the remaining conventional fuel consumption. So we've essentially disaggregated that potential and added some of it back to the low income and moderate income subsectors for this presentation. I would note, I think a takeaway is, and I think this is something we recognized early on in the process, that the low income target of 16% is going to be difficult to satisfy, even in this scenario where we're trying to accelerate capture of or adoption of clean heat measures in low income in the early years. We're still falling short of that 16%. So I think a lot of that just comes down to the distribution of emissions among sectors and subsectors. It's almost like a math problem to achieve that number. So it might bear some additional analysis on what was assumed when those targets were set. And that might shed some additional light on the assumptions we're using in the model to quantify what the potential is achieving here. Next slide, please. And Ben, I think
yeah, just a quick snapshot to wrap this up, and then Rick, I see your hand. We could address questions. Just overall next steps, incorporating feedback from you all today and over the next week, and continuing QC on the model and the inputs and the interactions that Matt talked about today, and also, excuse me, updating the RCI values, the updated emission values that we spoke to earlier, will be a big next step for us. And then just in terms of overall project timeline, today, the 25th of July, reviewing the optimized results to the tag with estimated final presentation and final results sometime mid-August. Obviously, between now and then, there'll be some iteration, discussion, and input and feedback from you all, as well as PSD and other stakeholders. So just wanted to put that on the screen.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Matt, Ben, others. Thank you very much. We obviously have a bunch of questions coming up. We're going to compress the remainder of our agenda so that we can continue while we have you. So if you can give us another 20 minutes or so, and we're going to set aside a few minutes for public comment as well. But with that, Catherine, I'll start with my question, if I may.
Go right ahead.
Okay, thank you. Again, thank you, gentlemen, very much. We really appreciate it. And we will, I'm sure individually, we'll be sending you comments within the next 5 days. I would just, 2 points come to mind for me. If you set slides 19 and 20 side by side, you might, and I think you might wrongly reach the conclusion that we're spending a lot on energy efficiency to achieve very little. am I correct when I say that energy efficiency, and we're talking about building envelope measures, weatherization, as you say, air infiltration, so on and so forth, is an absolute prerequisite for the achievement of savings by fuel switching measures, by installed measures. So that in fact, it's really appropriate to see whether energy efficiency here as in tandem with fuel switching measures. Is that a fair generalization? I wouldn't want, in other words, I wouldn't want someone to say, hey, let's not spend money on energy efficiency because it's not producing much. Because in fact, that would undermine the savings from fuel switching. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I'd want to take a look at the underlying, drivers of these numbers, before I'd be comfortable making a full response. But yeah, certainly, weatherization, building shell measures are going to have benefits down the hierarchy of measures as we talk about fuel switching, to reduce the loads, and could impact the cost of those equipment. Like if you can downsize, you could potentially reduce those costs associated with those measures. We haven't modeled any of that kind of downsizing. We've looked at this primarily from a loads perspective to deal with those interactive effects, but I think those are real factors. So I would agree with your generalization.
Okay. And my second point is about what's economic and uneconomic under the societal cost test. And you've alluded to this, what I'm about to say, but I want to put it in different words. And that is, the moment the Vermont legislature decided that these targets were the targets to be met, in effect, it seems to me they were saying, amongst other things, that the social cost of carbon is higher than we're currently using. That in fact, those limits, those reductions define what's economic and what's not. So
can I respond to that? I actually would phrase it a little bit differently.
Sure.
Is that the legislature has decided that that we want to go beyond what is societally economic in order to meet the targets that they have set out.
Well, we'll have a debate, you and I, TJ, at another time, but fair enough. It's really a debate about what's societally economic. Okay, those are my two comments for now. Thank you, Ken.
Yeah, I have three, and I think I can make them quick. First, I do want to follow up on that societal economic piece, and that is, I know the PUC has always used this sort of approach, but it really, I'll say, does not reflect what I used to do in economic analysis, in part because it does not look at in-state versus out-of-state economic activity. And I think as this topic moves forward into the public and to the legislature, to understand that difference of spending money in state, and weatherization is a great example. Weatherization is almost entirely an in-state economic activity. And the replacement of fossil fuels, in other words, the reduction in the purchase of a fossil fuel, is almost always an out-of-state economic activity. And just so people have a sense of that, I think will be important. So that's part one. Yeah. Point two is, this is my kid in a candy store analogy. I did get a chance to look at the workbook last night, and I have a request. I hope it can be accomplished. And that is, in that workbook, what I would love an additional set of columns, which is the number of units. So you have, each of the measures, a long list of measures, and you talk about the dollar values associated, the reductions associated, but they're all in bulk. And if it's possible, I hope it is, to add a set of columns, the number of units that are installed per year, that would really, really help me. And so I'll say kid in a candy store. I feel like a kid in a candy store in there, but some of those shelves are a little too high and I can't reach them. So if you could do that, that'd be great. And my third point is directed to my administration friends, and that is, this analysis is significantly different
than the EFG analysis. And the EFG analysis has been used as, you know, a lot of the discussions for the Climate Action Council, and perhaps some administration positions about our need to be aggressive. This is really, really different. And I'm hoping that there can be some sort of resolution of what the differences are, because again, the conclusions on how to move forward are very different from this than they were with that EFG piece. So yeah, no, don't expect a response
And
to that,
for
but I
those
want
of
my
us,
TAG members to hear that.
Ken, I was just wondering, for those of us not steeped in the EFG analysis, different in which direction?
Yeah, the EFG analysis says, A, we're going to hit the 2025 targets without doing anything. And hitting 2023, 2030 is very, very simple, and requires very small investments. This suggests very different response.
Yeah, so I can respond to things there. First, just on the in-state, out-of-state, I agree with your concept there, Ken, and I think it also is important to recognize that on the benefits. So often the flip way to think about what you were saying is how much do Vermonters pay to achieve societal benefits, which a lot of which accrue outside of Vermont. And so that's one side of the question. The other side is like the economic investment that happens within the state and like the weatherization benefits, et cetera, those kinds of things, where, you know, in avoiding fossil fuel purchases that have economic activity out of state. I agree with that as well, but there's kind of two sides to that. On the Energy Futures Group report, which was done for ANR and the department last year, I'll note that as it stands now, the net societal benefit actually was roughly the same. I don't know if those will hold over the time, but you know, when you took the gross cost and the benefit, you know, the net benefits were a positive quite a bit, but that may change as things get revised here. I'm not sure which way actually. And I think the EFG report, if I'm recalling correctly, just kind of assumed that we were going to hit the target, and assumed numbers of units. It was built up that way, whereas the department, the NV5 potential study has said, okay, 100% incentive levels, what would it take to actually reach the target? And there's kind of a big difference there in terms of cost. The Energy Futures Group report basically pushed costs out into the future, saying that the cost would be amortized over the life of the measures. So those are a couple things. Hopefully after September 1st, we can kind of put them next to each other and see.
Great. Thanks, DJ. Emily, you're next.
Yeah, I was just trying to wrap my head around, in the technical potential version of the analysis on slide 14, the dominant measures were ground source heat pumps, fossil fuel to wood heating, were kind of at the top of the list. But then when you get to the maximum achievable or the Act 18 optimized residential measures, or even the commercial measures, like if you look at all the measures, those measures don't really appear, and the dominant measures are heat pumps and you know, other types of heat pumps, ductless heat pumps. So could you kind of in plain language explain why that is? Like, what is it about the translation from the technical potential to I mean, I know it's something in the economics or the costs, but like, can you just walk me through why those measures drop off?
Yeah, I mean, briefly, it's the application of the adoption curves, because the technical potential assumes that any market barriers just don't matter, technical or otherwise. You know, I mean, there's a reason we don't see ground source heat pumps, you know, happening all over the place. You know, there are technical hurdles, permitting hurdles, cost hurdles. So, you know, even though, you know, when you remove those hurdles and you assume, hey, we could just do these everywhere, it looks like a big number. But, you know, when we introduce those impacts, we see, you know, a much lower uptake in the modeling.
and the same kind of situation for wood?
Yeah, I mean, and part of that is also informed by, you know, adoption in terms of, you know, fossil to wood conversions. You know, we take that into consideration too, in terms of like, you know, figuring out where to start those adoption curves. But I think that also applies there.
And that fossil fuel of wood, that would be like a central wood system, like an advanced wood heater. It's not like just a partial to a stove, right?
I think others would have to comment on that specific measure. I mean, I might be able to follow up. You know, there is an answer. I just don't know off the top of my head if that was a partial or full characterization.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. I can stop there. Thank you.
Thanks. Sam?
Thanks. I just wanted to, if you don't mind, go back to slide 27 quickly, just to reiterate the point that I made earlier around declining CI. So, you know, this is showing landfill gas getting kicked in 2030, wastewater being kicked in 2050. And I just went quickly to the CARB certified LCFS pathways and did an average for those feedstocks. And, you know, I think that's about right. So like the landfill gas average is currently at around 57. The wastewater average is around 39. That would track with what you have here, I think. But, you know, we know that basically at least half of that value is derived from the electricity input. Around half is also derived from the fuel input. So again, just to sort of double tap on the point I made earlier, we definitely would expect those to go down over time as the projects source cleaner energy and as even the grid becomes cleaner. So I don't have a proposed solution for you guys right now on this, but I do think that it may undercount a little bit some of the resources that will be in the mix in the long term.
Okay. Thank you. Floyd?
Yeah, no, two things just to add to what Sam just said on the 2050. This is along the lines of what the point I made earlier. In the CARB certified fuel pathways, there are a number of biomass-based diesel pathways that are on par with electricity carbon intensities in the range of 8 to 20 existing today. So a little bit of caution on a blanket statement that out of state resources for biodiesel and renewable diesel from these feedstocks would become ineligible. I don't think that's the case right now. And I don't think that would be the case, across the board for 2050. I do agree there may be some pathways that drop out, but a little bit of caution there. On slide 20, I do want to ask a question about the bullet referring to blending limits and available resources driving the plateauing of these biofuel, renewable fuel levels. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? I mean, biodiesel and renewable diesel right now could be used in, fuel burning equipment. They may require a little bit of a retrofit, $500 to $1,000 or so to get the right burners in place. But those retrofits are certified right now to 100% biodiesel and renewable diesel. So I'm not sure where this blend limit concept comes from. And then the supply constraints that's alluded to in this comment, I'd like to know where that comes from. What's the source of that? What are the supply curves? Where are those coming from? So, I appreciate a lot of, the great amount of work that went into this. I think it could benefit a bit more from a little bit more transparency in terms of where these things are coming from. And that would help us, kind of form our comment a little bit better.
Matt
Thank-
Sotz?
I can respond. Yeah. Yeah, thanks for the comment. I can respond to the blending limits assumed, and then I can kick it over to Bill to talk a little bit about the resource constraints that were modeled. The blending limits applied, specifically to certain pathways. So biodiesel, we imposed a cap of, because we were modeling this as like essentially kind of top-down overall blending as opposed to, facility by facility, opportunities which would require like burner retrofits. We applied a 20% blending limit for biodiesel, but the renewable diesel pathways are all assumed, 100%. There's no cap on that. On green hydrogen, we assumed a 7% blending limit there, to get it in existing gas infrastructure. But other than that, like the biomethane pathways don't have a cap. So it's a fairly limited number of blending limits, only applied to certain pathways. And again, kind of reflecting this top-down approach to the clean fuels potential. But Bill, any comments on the constraints and the available resource?
Yeah, and to add to that, yeah, the for example, like RNG that's produced in state is kind of limited by, what is considered to be like reasonable potential from the Vermont RNG potential study. And I think the remainder of a lot of the other biofuels are based off of like an allocation of a fair share of different types of feedstocks to different biofuel pathways. So there's a little bit of a competition kind of baked into converting biofeedstocks into renewable fuel. And as a result of that, there's that inherent limit as well. Trying to remember if there's anything else, but I think that's about it. Oh, and wood is kind of based off of already. I don't think wood's considered like wood is also based off of, historical consumption of wood in the state.
Can I respond real quick to that?
Sure.
So on the supply constraints, there's a large amount of data from USDA and other folks that we'd be happy to provide. I'm not certain whether there's an assumption of a static fixed amount of feedstocks, therefore you get that competition that was mentioned. There certainly is a growing amount of feedstocks in response to a number of carbon policies across the country. So I'm not sure to what extent that has been incorporated and accounted for. But just make sure that you're using, the best available data with respect to feedstock supplies. On the blending limit, it sounds to me that that's a relic of the assumption that 20% biodiesel in the transportation applications is being transferred over to the heating sector here. I would submit to you that there is no, that is not technically supportable in this sector. And I would question whether that assumption really makes sense here. Like I mentioned earlier, there are commercially available burners that are certified for use and are being used with 100% biodiesel and renewable diesel. So, there is no, from my perspective, technical barrier for using blends beyond 20% for biodiesel. And you can certainly go 100% with each of those fuels today.
Thanks, Floyd. Emily?
Yeah, thank you. I was just curious if NV5 could give a quick review or synopsis of how you've coordinated with Opinion Dynamics, like to what extent your assumptions, you might not know the full answer to this question, but we, I think, as a TAG, have an interest in making all these analyses consistent. So if you could just remind us, like, I think you've coordinated behind the scenes. Are you aware of places where you've used similar assumptions, or is there a lot of work to be done to align those?
Ben, can you answer this one?
Yeah, yep. We coordinated with Opinion Dynamics on a few of the elements. One, the emissions, some of the emissions numbers that we're using. We were ensuring that we were both aligned on those, as well as the Clean Heat Standard measures. So the measure categories that we're using and they're using, we've aligned on as well. I think where we've diverged, not necessarily in content, but just the timing of their project and our project. Those were the last two main elements that that we've coordinated on. But I think part of this process will be documenting what that is, and happy to give the TAG and the PUC and everyone else a summary of exactly what those are, because I agree those are important. But those were the two main elements that we've coordinated on, if that helps.
Right.
So does that include the carbon intensity, like the fuel stuff? Have you coordinated with them specifically around the assumptions for those?
I'll need to, yeah, let me get back to you on that. I need to look into that one specifically.
Okay,
Right.
thank you.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments from TAG members? And if not, Catherine, I'm going to hand it to you for public comment.
Yeah, I'd like to bump the public comment up, but before that, it looks like TJ, you wanted to sort of close this out. I would appreciate, yeah, if you could tell us generally how follow-up comments should be submitted, as well as how NV5 will share any responses to some of the outstanding questions.
Right. So thank you all for your questions. All this is very helpful as we review, as the Department of Public Service, the NV5's work here also, and try and get the best product out there. We'll take comments ideally by next Wednesday, a week after we sent this out last night, so a week from yesterday. And if you could put them to that address at the top, that would be the best for future comments. We will try to coordinate the distribution of data of responses to those questions, and how they were incorporated or considered is probably the best word to use there. And send that out this month being in August. I don't have a specific timeline for responding to those comments, as we kind of really just try and make changes that we talked about today and consider other feedback. So really psd.cleanheat@vermont.gov is the address to send that to, and we will get responses out, and the department will coordinate that. I really also, just in providing feedback, want to just frame one thing, and just to keep in mind that the potential study is not an implementation plan. And so there will be, this is kind of the potential study. And as you might imagine, there's assumptions in there, right? Like one assumption was 125% of the incentive level goes to low income in the optimized study. Well, obligated entities may not do that. And so they're going to have their own implementation plan. So the potential study is helpful to give us an idea of kind of a trajectory to help set obligation targets, and to move us forward in this process of designing the clean heat standard. But it's not actually dispositive, and like one thing from this potential study is not necessarily going to be kind of the final clean heat standard design. And all of this, I think, is like a bit of an iterative process as we wade through being really in the lead and designing a program like the clean heat standard in the thermal sector going forward. So again, thank you all for your comments, and we can we can go to public comment, which was.
It looks like Emily, you have one last question before we open it up for public comment.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going through my notes and just one addendum to my request for kind of a summary of how you coordinated with Opinion Dynamics. Another specific question I have about that, in addition to the measure level assumptions, is the assumptions around the baseline. Like, I was just looking at your baseline is the existing condition, whereas their early win deliverable baseline is a new water heater of the same size, which I think is different than the existing condition water heater. So that's another one that if you two turn out to be using totally different baselines, that could really influence the savings potential in the analyses. So if you could document kind of where you might be similar or different on that front as well. Thank you.
Will do.
All right, then let's open it up for public comment. We'd like each individual who wants to make a comment to raise your hand. I see there are comments or questions in the chat as well. I prefer that they be verbalized, or if not, we can forward them to NV5 for response. But Pike Porter, you had your hand up. You want to move to there, Pike?
Yes, thank you. I want to push against this idea of a 0.3 global warming potential. The global warming potential for wood for Vermont should be at least 1, and the emission factor should be the emission factor produced by the EPA emission factor table that you're using for all other gases. I sent an email to hopefully all TAG members earlier today, and some of you a couple of weeks ago, but NV5 cites a Liu analysis to support its 0.3 GWP, and that analysis is not appropriate for the wood that we are burning here in Vermont. The Liu analysis looks at wood that where the bowls are used for hardwood products, and the rest would remain on the floor to decompose anyway. That's not the appropriate counterfactual. There's a Holtzmark analysis that indicates that the carbon emissions factor, the GWP should be at least 1, maybe 1.2. And the Liu analysis itself says, with respect to the Holtzmark analysis, the high GWP biofactor in Holtzmark results could be reasonable if, as assumed in this study, all the trunks and harvested residues were used for biomass combustion. This suggests that all the changes of major carbon pool in the stand could be accounted for biomass combustion. The Holtzmark says, as a counterfactual, that the wood that is not cut and burned for combustion is going to remain standing, and for the Vermont wood that's used for combustion in the thermal sector, that's the case. So again, we need a GWP of 1 for wood, and we need a full emissions factors as calculated in EPA. In the comments section, as an aside, but I put it in comments because I wanted people to have the exact citation. ANR has not yet met its obligations to create rules around the greenhouse gas inventory. And until they do so, the inventory can't be considered official. And the rules need to account for biogenic emissions. That's clear in the statute. And ANR has not been doing that appropriately, and it needs to. And any rules that this organization adopts that are based on a faulty gas inventory with respect to wood is going to be suspect. You know, ANR received over a year ago a notice of intent to sue based on their failure to draft these rules. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Sorry, let me unmute. Jared Duvall.
Folks, drop your hands if you're no longer, yeah, great.
Thank you. My name is Jared Duvall. I serve as an appointed member of the Vermont Climate Council. where I sit on the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee and co-chair the council's science and data subcommittee. First, just thanks to the TAG and to NV5 for your work in this presentation. I wanted to ask Ben if you could please go back to the early slides of your presentation, specifically the ones that show the emissions numbers and targets, because I want to share some important information relative to the baseline assumptions that are embedded in the potential study draft, specifically the question of the appropriate 2030 and 2050 RCI emissions targets related to the Clean Heat Standard. I'll also share this comment that I'm about to make with the Public Service Department at the provided email address, but I think it's important enough that I want to share it with the entire TAG. So the Affordable Heat Act, Act 18 of 2023, is designed to achieve thermal or RCI sector emissions reductions in service of helping to meet overall economy-wide GWSA climate pollution reduction targets. While the Global Warming Solutions Act, Act 153 of 2020, requires that Vermont's total greenhouse gas emissions be at least 40% below 1990 levels by January 1st of 2030 and 80% below 1990 levels by January 1st, 2050, the GWSA does not set forth sectoral shares of responsibility within that overall economy-wide target. That sectoral target determination was left to the Vermont Climate Council. So specifically, 592D2 of the GWSA says that the Vermont Climate Action Plan shall further the following objective, and that is to provide for greenhouse gas emissions reductions that reflect the relative contribution of each source or category of source of emissions. In responding to that legislative responsibility that was given to us on the council, and as part of the initial Vermont Climate Action Plan, the Climate Council decided to establish 2018, not 1990 or 2005, as the reference year for determining sectoral responsibility. And that's because 2018 was the most recent year for which emissions estimates were available post GWSA passage and at the time that we were working on the Climate Action Plan. One of the main reasons that we decided to do that is that sectoral shares of overall emissions relative to the total were very different in 1990 or even 2005 than they have been recently. And it did not make sense to us to hold sectors responsible for long ago emissions proportions that were, no longer the case at the time the GWSA passed. I'm going to put in the chat, and I'll also include it in the comment I submit, the decision, the memo that was unanimously adopted by the Climate Council establishing that. But I want to pause on what does that actually mean? So what Matt Sachs described was a needed 40% reduction below 1990 emissions levels in the RCI sector. So that would be going from 2.26 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent to 1.36 million metric tons, or a 0.90 reduction. And that's based on the just released inventory. But the council's sectoral proportionality decision means that RCI's share of the January 1st, 2030 or 2029 annual maximum allowed emissions should be calculated in reference to 2018 GHG emissions, in which, again, in the latest inventory, RCI was 31% of emissions. If you compare that back to 1990, RCI only made up 26% of emissions. So what's the takeaway here? Last part. Using the approach that was approved by the council means that we should aim to go from 2.26 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which was the 1990 RCI emissions as estimated in this latest inventory, to no more than 1.61 million metric tons by January 1st of 2030 or 2029 annual emissions in the RCI sector, not down to 1.36 million metric tons carbon dioxide equivalent, which is what you get if you do 40% below 1990 levels. So compared to the 1990 emissions, that would be a reduction of RCI sector emissions by January 1st, 2030 of 0.66 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, not of 0.90. So stated differently, based on the council's sectoral proportionality decision that's enshrined in the Climate Action Plan, the RCI sector should aim to achieve a 29% reduction in emissions relative to 1990 by 2030, rather than a 40% reduction. And if you look out to the January 1st, 2050 GWSA requirement, that would mean going from the 2.26 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 1990 to no more than 0.54 million metric tons of 2049 annual emissions, rather than down to 0.45 by January 1st, 2050. So that would be a 76% reduction in RCI emissions by January 1st, 2050 relative to 1990, rather than an 80% reduction. And so I just wanted to share this because I think it's really important that we get these baseline assumptions right, in line with statute and in line with approved decisions of the Vermont Climate Council and the Climate Action Plan. Thank you.
NV5 have any comment or response at this moment? Or you just want to take that information in?
Yeah, I can just respond quickly, and we'll look at that, Jared. Thanks for that comment, and we may follow up just to look at that relative to the statute and talk with you in the coming weeks. We certainly want to make sure we get the target right. So thanks.
All right, the next in the queue is an individual with the phone number ending 5603. If you could unmute and tell us your name and affiliation.
Hello, this is Thomas Weiss. Thank you for taking my call. I've got two comments, one which turns out to be a follow-on to what Jared Duval just stated. And that is, if the comments go through the Department of Public Services site or email address, how do the parties know what the comments of others were made? Because his comment is, I think, very important to possibly shaping some of my future comments. So if it goes to the DPS without going through the EPUC site, how do the parties know what the comments are? And my second one is more a question for NV5. I noticed that in the optimum and the other scenario, that the emissions increase in 2050, a small increase from 2049. And so I'm wondering why that happened, and if one continues farther out in the future, do they eventually drop below the 80% level? So those are my two comments and my question.
Yeah,
So,
I can quickly follow up on.
Oh, go ahead, Matt. You go first.
Yeah, the drop in 2050 is specifically because of some of those biofuels and renewable fuels pathways dropping out in that year. So that's kind of an isolated impact, not a trend of overall reductions over time.
Thank you.
And I'll respond on the comments question. What we'll do, which is becoming our standard practice after the process we use for the renewable energy standard over the past 2 years, we will summarize the comments received, most likely without attribution, and how they're responded. And so some comments may get aggregated if they're similar comments, but we'll summarize those that are received and how were responded. We I think to be determined, we'll either post on our website and let the tag know that it's there, or we will file an EPUC. I'm not sure exactly how we'll do that yet, but we'll make sure that the document where we do that is publicly available. It's a very good point. I appreciate it.
I guess I'm concerned with that answer because I consider the potential study to be part of Act 18 and part of the clean heat standard. So I guess I'm confused as to why it's not going through EPUC so that we can all see the actual comments themselves and not just a summary.
Sorry, the potential study itself will be filed in EPUC, and this is all part of the process that we've decided to kind of open up the potential study to get as much input and feedback as possible. You know, we can see if the questions are available depending on the number and scope of questions, whether it makes sense to put them in word for word or to organize them in a manner that makes the question and response document the most readable and publicly accessible. We need to make these things accessible for everybody to be able to grasp and understand. And you know, we strive to be as public and open as we can, and so we'll do our best there.
Thank you for your response.
Yeah, thanks, TJ. Clarification. And we have Dylan and Judy lined up next. Dylan?
Yes, hello. Thank you for the opportunity to comment. I'm Dylan Giambattista with VGS. We have some written comments that we'll be submitting, but specifically I wanted to ask a question related to the potential study. There's a charge within the statute related to have the workforce characteristics necessary to meet demand for these types of measures over time. And I just wondered if there was any information about how workforce was being factored into this, if there were scenarios or data that you were drawing upon for determining these assumptions. So thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Yeah, Dylan, I can respond to that real quick. We are working on workforce, mainly incorporating the optimized results into what the workforce would need to be to support that. So that's to come in the next few weeks, which will be shared to the group, but mainly using baseline workforce that exists now to meet what's happening in the market, using the optimized results to drive what the discrepancy would be based on the workforce needs to meet the potential results we're looking at here. And in summary, the workforce is kind of following those adoption curve trends where you will be seeing workforce needs more front-loaded than they would be later in the year. I'm kind of following the results, but yes, we are working on that now, incorporating these results, and we'll have that within the next few weeks.
Great. Judy Taranovich? Judy, have you figured out how to unmute? You're still muted. Should be a microphone next to your image. Can't figure it out. I'm gonna put your question.
We're at the
chat.
bottom.
Yeah, there's a microphone at the bottom of your screen and there's a microphone next to your picture. Either one should work. Can't figure it out. All right, why don't you, if you have a question you want to put it in the chat. And let me just ask, there were some other questions in the chat. Does anybody else want to verbalize their questions for NV5 from the public? No others?
Yeah, let me just say that we may not have those questions kind of recorded in the future. So send them also to the email address if you don't want to verbalize them.
Ms. Taranovich, you may need to exit full screen mode in order to find your icons. Give me one last chance there.
Well, while you're trying to sort that out, I am going to hand it over to you, Rick, for the rest of the meeting as I've got to depart for the airport.
Okay.
All right.
Well, yeah.
Make you the host.
Okay. While Ms. Taranovich still looks for her mute button, we'll move on and we'll try to reserve time for you if we can. Otherwise, please send your question directly to the department. Okay. With that, many thanks to the department and to NV5 and the folks who've given us the presentation today. Thank you very much. This is long, detailed, really appreciate it. And of course, everyone, both on the tag and in the public, should feel free to send comments, as TJ has said, to that email address. Okay. Thank you. Well, moving on, we've compressed everything here. We've only got really 8 more minutes, and I'm assuming that we don't want to extend the time frame. Unless the tag tells me otherwise, we will close at 12:30. Ken, we want to talk about your reconciliation memo. Can we do it in a way that tees us up for the next meeting?
Sure. I hope people take a look at it, and I think it's appropriate for individuals to send me any questions and observations that then I can use to help prepare for a presentation that covers those. But just in general, the reason for doing this, there are a lot of numbers in there, and it is not to focus on those numbers with regards to how many ton reduction, but rather to compare if we're measuring first the baseline using the inventory approach and the life cycle analysis approach, and then the different types of measures, what it means in terms of the results, and therefore what it means for the PUC to consider how to move forward. That was the intent there. So if you want to, challenge the carbon intensity factors, please don't. I mean, we're going to have to resolve those later. And the actual number of ton reduction, please don't. That's going to have to be done later. It is that comparison when the ton reduction is measured using inventory, when the ton reduction is measured using life cycle. That was the intent. And again, bottom line for me is installed measures don't make much difference, and delivered fuels do make a difference. But please take a look, pose questions to me. I think you can do that, and then we'll structure the discussion for the next time.
Yeah, absolutely. Feel free to contact Ken directly. And then we'll tee it up for the next meeting. Okay, let's see. Other outstanding issues for tag consideration. We're going to really compress this. So, Michelle, do you want to tell us where the pacing group stands?
This will be quick. Thank you, Rick. The pacing subgroup did meet last week to go over the 5 bullets that were on a slide we shared at the last tag meeting, and came to the conclusion that while it seemed worthwhile to explore those further and document them, there's too much information that we still don't have. So it is on the record for PUC consideration.
You may have to allow, yes, click allow.
Stephanie Austin, I think you're not, yeah, there you go. Go ahead, Michelle.
So no further documentation's going to the PUC at this time. Thank you.
Great, and we can take those issues up later as needed. Terrific. Matt, quick one on current year versus prior year. Any status to report?
I think there was to be a great conversation after the filing on Monday from the obligated parties. So
Okay.
I'd like to, with your discretion and the amount of time we have, just hold that for later.
Sure. After Monday, let's put that on the agenda. Okay. And as for me on double counting, I'll bring that back up next time. I've been doing some, reconnaissance on the question. Spoken with ANR, spoken with some other folks. I'll come back to you with my thoughts on this, but there are some public comments on the question of double counting that are raising issues that may or may not be, pertinent to it, but I've got to take a look at them. So I'll come back to you with some thoughts on what we ought to do, if anything, on the question at this point. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Matt, and to Emily Roscoe for a quick update on the EAG.
Sure. A really quick update. Mia, the Equity Advisory Group chair, did an analysis of what we know about the housing stock in Vermont populations. So that was in the shared meeting materials, and we just kind of reviewed that as some grounding. We had a part 2 discussion around renters and rental homeowners, an initial discussion around minorities of Vermonters of color and Indigenous populations. And then we had a quick credit issues subgroup update. And that's about it. The main discussions being around renters and rental homeowners, and that initial discussion on Vermonters of colors and Indigenous populations that we're starting to write the report. And I'll hand it over to Matt.
Yeah, I would just say that Mia Watson has put together an excellent spreadsheet that shows which individuals. Sorry, can you hear me now?
It sounds like Rick is having some technical difficulties, so I think you should keep going, Matt, while Rick fixes that.
Thank you, Emily. Just wanted to say that Mia Watson, our chair of EAG, has put together an excellent spreadsheet. I hope she can share it with TAG, or has been shared already, which shows the different homeowners versus renters versus fuel type. It's a wonderful data source that she has compiled, and I encourage people to look at it.
Great. And thank you, Emily. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, Rick. And while I've burst in, I also wanted to note that Judy Taranovich, of the public, has seemingly unmuted in case we wanted to circle back.
Sure. Ms. Taranovich?
Uh-oh. Well, you
look
look unmuted, but we still can't hear you. Oh, so I think the request is for some breakdown of how the total program cost would look on a per gallon basis for fuel users, per gallon of propane, just reading from the chat.
Okay. TJ heard that.
Yeah, so I'm hopeful that we could, it depends on the allocation of costs and the specific measures and specific fuels that are used, but I'm hopeful we could show an estimate of that in the final version. Right now we have the high level overall costs, and I think it is useful context to see how that might break down. There are going to be a lot of changes, so I wouldn't want to guesstimate that right now, but.
Great. Thanks. Okay, we have come to the end of our time. Let me just say, with respect to the review of TAG tasks and schedule, we'll come back to that at our next meeting. But I do direct you to Deirdre Morris's spreadsheet, which you've all gotten copies of. And we're actually sticking to, we've done a fairly good job of sticking to the proposed outline there. And I'll just, I'll prepare something more concise for the next meeting. Forgive me for not being able to do it for this meeting. But we're tackling the tasks that have been assigned to us as well as we can in the time that we have. So I would say we're on schedule, but if it's going to be a busy fall, no question. With that, any other comments from TAG members? And one last chance for public comment on other matters, any matters. And if not, I certainly will take a motion to adjourn if we actually use that these days.
So moved.
So moved by Matt. And all in favor can signify by signing off. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Take care.